키가 작아서 마이크가 힘드네요. 저희 5번째 세션 지금 막 들어오시는 분도 계신데 이제 시작하겠습니다. 저희가 지금 이 3번째 세션은 조금 패널들이 많으신데 그 발표를 하실 패널은 이렇게 앞에 앉아 계시고요. 나중에 이제 라운드 테이블 때 2분이 더 올라가셔서 라운드 테이블을 같이 해주실 거예요. 그래서 총 5분이 함께 마지막 세션은 이루어진다고 보시면 될 것 같습니다. 저희 지금 모더레이터로 멜라니 걸리스가 지금 앉아 계신데 바로 멜라니 걸리스가 패널들 소개하시면서 5번째 세션 시작하겠습니다. Should we start it, Melanie?
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, KAMS and Talking Galleries for bringing me to South Korea for the first time as well, and making me feel so welcome. Thank you for coming to the last session today. What's next? The future of the Asian art market, which is a great question, and I have some fantastic panelists to help answer that. I'm just going to say a few words by way of introduction, just to give a bit of a context. I have worked as a journalist in the art market for 11 years now, and I started at the Art newspaper, which is a newspaper that covers all aspects of art, so not just the market. Museums, policy, regulation, anything that touches the cultural world. And it's quite rare in that world that the art market makes front page news. But I remember 2 times in particular when it did. First was in 2011, when a report written by the brilliant Clare McAndrew on my far left here, which found that in 2010, China had overtaken the UK art market and had become the second biggest market in the world by value of sales, and it was by 1%, I think, but this was quite a dramatic change. Suddenly, we had to learn about auction houses such as China Guardian and Poly Auction, and we went to art fairs such as Art HK in Hong Kong, which later became Art Basel Hong Kong, which Adeline on my left is now runs for Art Basel in Asia. The second time that Asia made big news in London was when I did a bit of number crunching, and I found that those 2 auction houses the next year, in 2012, their sales had halved. And it seemed to a lot of us who had seen markets and buyers come and go from Russia, from the Middle East, from South America, that the China and the Asia story was another flash in the pan. There were problems, there were questions about the data in the first place, there were reports about people bidding for works but not actually buying them. It seemed quite easy to write off. One of my greatest surprises, and a very, very pleasant surprise, is that it was wrong to write it off. The growth of the art market and art enthusiasts in China and the speed of that enthusiasm has been extraordinary and very, very real. Just yesterday, I had to write an article about Hauser & Wirth, huge international gallery, opening in Hong Kong, and actually, they were a little late to the game. This has been happening for a while, but they're also opening offices in Shanghai and Beijing, and we're of course not just talking about Hong Kong and China anymore. I'm excited to be here now to see the galleries and the art fairs and galleries that I've only previously seen in booths at art fairs, and to see people in action is extraordinary here. There's a real energy. And there are many other cities in Asia adding their perspective and talent to our world. And all this comes at a time when markets elsewhere, particularly in Europe, where I'm from, are quite fragile. We need you all. I suspect the title of this session shouldn't be the future of the Asian art market, but the future is the Asian art market, and I greatly look forward to hearing the views of our excellent speakers. I will give them 10 to 15 minutes each. I'll give you slightly bit more detail about them. So we will start with Clare McAndrew, who is an independent cultural economist and an author who founded Arts Economics in 2005. Clare's annual number crunching of the art market, now commissioned by Art Basel and UBS, has become an art market Bible. So I really look forward to hearing what she has to say.
Thanks very much, Melanie. And let me echo the thanks for the invitation here it's also my first time in Korea, so it's fantastic to be here. The Asian art market, I suppose, has been, for somebody like me that looks very much at the big picture of what's going on in the global art market, it's really been one of the defining trends of the last decade. And it's really changed how the market looks and how the market operates. So it's been a huge input into my research over the last 10, 15 years. This is looking at the art market sales over 25 years, and you'll see there's been astonishing growth. So from the lowest point, say in 1991, to the peak of the art market in 2014, the art market grew about 600%. So it's been a huge increase in the value of sales. And in the last 10 years especially, a lot of the impetus for that growth has been Asia. It's been sales, predominantly in China, have added a big chunk to that number, but also purchases by Asian buyers in traditional centers as well as in Asia. So Asia's been a phenomenal influence on that growth in the last 10 years. And I think it's also, the market's now more globally diversified. It might be more internally competitive, but it's protected the market from some of its downside risks. And I think if you look at how the market recovered from the recession in 1991, it took possibly 15 years for the market to get back to where it was. Whereas if you look at the recession in 2009, it kind of bounced back straight away. And a big part of that it wasn't just reliant on the US and the UK and Europe. It had all this kind of Asian buying and sales. And at a time when markets were falling apart a little bit from the global financial crisis, China especially was starting this tremendous boom in sales. China and Asia, it depends really how you define it, and I'll leave that to someone who's more expert, but if you look at the main Asian countries in terms of sales, it accounts for about a quarter of the sales in the global art market. And as Melanie was just saying, China has been an amazing one to watch, because it came from, when I started doing these reports years ago for TAFAF, I think in the first one, China was about 5% back in 2006 or 7. And it's literally come from there to being, last year, the third largest market, but temporarily in 2011, the largest market worldwide as well. So it's changed the face of this global picture. If you looked at that pie, 15 years ago, it wouldn't even be really on the map at all. So it's been phenomenal growth, and it's really changed the way the market looks. This is just comparing the two of the major markets at the moment, China and the US, just to show you where they came from back in 2006. Even at that stage, the US was more than 5 times the size of the Chinese market, and just the way they developed, as Melanie said, took over from the UK in 2010, and then 2011 temporarily being the largest market worldwide by a small margin. And since then, sales a little bit more subdued, but it's still this integral part now of the picture. When we talk about the global art market, it's a very important slice. Besides sales that happen on the ground, another interesting way to look at the influence of Asia is to look at cross-border trade. So how much art comes in and out of Asia, and this is an important element of the picture as well. And I think while China and especially Hong Kong have been very important hubs, a lot of the other markets in Asia, and I just picked the top 5 in terms of trade there, are quite local in nature. So there's a lot of local artists sold, and even for local artists, I think once they reach a certain level, they then often get sold either in Hong Kong or in markets even outside of Asia. So in terms of exporting, Asia as a whole is a fairly small share of global exports. You'll see the US such a huge, and the UK, they're real entrepot markets. Things come in and out of them all the time. The flow of trade is very circular. And again, China accounting for around half of the exports from Asia. Where Asia has made a bigger dent, I think, is in imports as a buyer of art in the world. And again, China is an important part of that, but other markets as well, important buyers. And if you look at the major auction houses now, the top two, around 30% of their buyers in terms of value now are from Asia. And that's bigger in some cases than their European buyers. So it's a huge change compared to, again, 10 or 15 years ago. And it's a very much a wealth-driven dynamic to some extent. As wealth in Asia has grown, the demand for all luxury goods, and art is a luxury good in terms of its wealth economics, have been increasing. And that's been met by local sales as well as sales in London and New York and Hong Kong. Just another thing that's interesting about imports is the kind of the content of who's been doing the buying. And I suppose if you went back to 1990, I haven't got it here, but if you go back a few years, Japan accounted for 30% of the global imports. It was a huge buyer. And this was this art bubble, this kind of famous art bubble that was fueled by Japanese buying, mainly in the Impressionist sector. And it was very much a demand-based bubble. There was a big inflationary build-up of wealth, but mainly down to the property market. And a lot of buying, in, as I said, in French Impressionists, a lot of really crazy prices being paid for sometimes works that were just only of fairly mediocre value. And this ended quite abruptly in 1990, where the Bank of Japan raised interest rates, and a lot of the more speculative people in the market, their wealth portfolios fell apart, not because of their art collections, but because of their other investments. And the Japanese left the market then. They were such important, as Japan is the black segment. And then buying from Asia was fairly subdued, and it wasn't really until China came back again around 2006 that we saw the importing starting to rise again. And if you look, I don't know if you can kind of tell by the slide, but the top grey part is India. And I remember doing the KAF reports around this time when there was India and China. And there was a lot of speculation about which one was going to be the big global market to take over, because they were kind of, at that stage, you didn't really know which one was going to take off, and it very, very much has been China. And now accounting for, as we saw on the previous slide, around 9% of imports, and the whole of the Asian market being very much an important buyer, both locally and, as I said, in markets like London and New York. What's driving all that? Wealth is a big factor. This is the growth in GDP per capita over the last 10 years. And you can really see that the three-digit growth rates are all in the kind of so-called new Chinese economy. I don't have Japan there. Japan is actually not the same. It's quite it's a very mature economy, and the GDP average incomes have been growing at about 9% over the last 10 years. But you'll see, China, Philippines, India, Indonesia, Hong Kong, all growing at rates of over 50%. Compared to the average of the G7, would be about 25%. And you'll see some very sad news in Europe there, with incomes even dropping. It's a dynamic thing as well, so it's not just happening over the last 10 years. These are also forecast to be the fastest growing incomes over the next 5 years and ongoing. And I think it's kind of amazing to think about, if you looked back at the 90s, the average income in the US was about 70 times the average incomes in China. If you went to 2006, it was about 20 times. Now it's about 7 times. So the gap is narrowing. But there's still, in countries like China and other parts of Asia, there's still a very small proportion of the population engaged in the art market. So really rapidly growing average incomes and a very small portion engaged in the art market. It's a really positive signal for development in the future, potential development anyway in the future. So the wealth dynamics are very positive for how these markets will develop in future. Another really crucial thing for the art market is high net worth individuals, millionaires, billionaires, and they're spending, the art market is so skewed at the moment towards the top end. So the activities of a relatively small bunch of people have such an influence on the kind of the research I do and the macro figures. And this is, the US is obviously still one of the largest homes to millionaires. This is population, global share by population. But you can see there Asia defined, I've included Australia and a few countries in there. Again, this is a problem of definition. But it accounts for nearly 24%. And even much larger when you look at billionaires. Billionaires are nearly 40% based in Asia. And there was this really interesting finding, I was just discussing it with Melanie earlier, that UBS did a billionaires report, and they said that every 3 days there's a billionaire created in Asia, which is phenomenal. So this is population. Net worth, yeah. It's not just the population, it's also their wealth. And this is high net worth individuals. So this is a slightly different definition. This is of investable assets over $1 million. But it's just to show really the changing dynamic over time. I mean, it was a big thing last year. The wealth in the Asia-Pacific region was larger than in North America. And from looking at these statistics of high net worth individuals for the last 15 years, that's the first time ever. I mean, it's the first time in history, but it was really interesting for me to see that it just edged up, that this Asia-Pacific region has more wealth than the US. And this is the forecast. This is from Capgemini, who do these world wealth reports every year, and they forecast that by 2025 it'll account for...
Sorry, thanks.
That's a sure sign I'm talking too long, so I'll hurry up. But that's really interesting to see that it's not just the population, it's the wealth dynamics happening there as well, and a big change. And within Asia, China and Japan are still very much the centers for high net worth wealth. Japan, especially in terms of population, but both China and Japan in terms of wealth. But there's other very important countries that are spawning very important global collectors. And as I say, they're not just buying in Asia, but buying out in the world as well, even though their local markets are quite small. It's not just the influence of sales on the ground, it's the influence they're having globally that's important from my perspective. And as I said, the dynamics on the wealth side are just so positive because at the moment, there's such a small fragment of the population. It's these millionaires and billionaires in Asia doing a lot of the heavy buying. And what countries like China need is they need more of what you have in droves in North America and Europe to some extent is the upper middle class. So this really supports the middle market as well. But the projections here are really positive, and these are from McKinsey, that by 2020, first of all, urban populations in China are going to grow the fastest. And then the projections are that by 2020, this upper middle class will actually be the largest segment in urban populations. And this is a hugely important thing for the art market because it's very thin in Asia and especially in China at the moment. It's driven by such a small activity, and you see such high buy-in rates and things in China. Part of that's got to do with particular things about the auctions and quality and things like that, but part of it's driven by the fact that there's just not enough buyers, I think, for the supply that's there. So this is a hugely important dynamic that's happening. The wealth dynamics are really strong in Asia, but money isn't the end of it, and money isn't everything. Having a large population of high net worth individuals is probably a necessary condition for having a good, healthy art market, but it's not a sufficient condition. And I always look at Australia, Japan, those kind of markets that have a huge number of high net worth individuals, but they have really small art markets. So there's more to it. So I always kind of say there's three cogs in the wheel. There's wealth, which we've got in Asia, but people are buying elsewhere. There has to be something else. The second element, I think, is having highly developed cultural infrastructure. And this is still developing in parts of Asia and China. And Uli was talking earlier about professionalism and experts and the institutions and things like that. And this is a really critical element. And again, it's kind of slightly a historical thing. It's a phase of catching up in some newer art markets. These things take a long time to develop around the market. Not just the institutions, but the gallery structures, the ancillary services that go with it, shipping and all those kind of things, specialized services that go with the art market they take time to develop. And then the last one, which is a really important one, is the favorable legal environment. This is both internally, having a marketplace that encourages businesses to buy and sell art, and also externally is a critical thing, encouraging a healthy flow of art. And some countries do it good one way, they push the art out, they don't let it back in. Other countries are poor on both. And this is a key element in Asia. And I think if you look at the US, it's really been the key market since the 1950s, and the money moved to the US, and the art market followed in a way, and it stayed there because it gets the balance very well balanced between having a business-friendly environment that people can conduct business in, they can import and export very easily, and it's easy to do business there. It's a fiscally friendly environment to do business in, but it's also a very well protected marketplace for consumers. So you know things are guaranteed, you've got comeback and all those things. So these are all the factors I think that influence an art market. And I think the markets in Asia that get all those three elements right are really going to be the ones that dominate the most in future.
Thank you very, very much, Claire. I love your cogs. That's super. Also, lots more numbers for us to keep stealing in our presentations going forward. Thank you. Adeline, we will talk next. Adeline is always a reminder to me that the news never sleeps, because I think it was pretty much the last day of 2014 when I got the news that Adeline had become director of Art Basel in Asia, where she runs the fair in Hong Kong, which has been and is an incredibly important influence and a fantastic fair, and has done incredible things for the continent. Adeline also travels all around, so I'm very much looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Thank you. Over to you, Adeline.
Thanks, Melanie. Well, the truth is you would have gotten the news a little bit earlier had I found a scanner. But the problem was I had troubles finding a scanner during Christmas break, so I couldn't send the contract out to Art Basel soon enough. Anyway, sorry for ruining all your Christmas holidays.
It was always good to have an excuse.
Okay, yes, the future of the Asian art market. I think, can you hear me okay? Or is it just because
if you maybe get a little bit closer.
Is this okay? Yeah.
It's stuck.
Sorry, I'm just sort of not great.
No, would you rather have a handheld? Yeah,
Hey. Okay,
Yay.
now it's better. Right. Well, before we go into the future of the Asian art market, I thought, I think when Claire, Melanie, and I spoke about this, I thought it was very important to just sort of spend this first 10 minutes reminding ourselves, that the sort of where Asia is really. Because, I mean, frankly, from the overseas standpoint, Asia is one big continent. But usually in my line of work, when someone says to me, I'm interested in the Asian art market, or hey, how's the Asian art market doing? My first question would be, which part do you mean? And I'm glad that Claire showed you all these stats, because in some ways, our presentation relates so much to each other. And I thought, I'll spend this 10 minutes playing geography teacher a little bit, but just bear with me, because I think it's just important to just map out the different key regions, because I think, as a concept, of course, it's Asia. It stretches all the way from Turkey, and if you include the Asia Pacific, then it's, then basically, we're looking at the yellow and the purple regions, right? So as far as we understand Asia, usually we say it's broadly defined by Turkey all the way across the Pacific to New Zealand. But we know that that's a whole lot of landmass to cover, and we also know that Asia is in different stages of development. And it's also, a lot of it has to do with our histories, independence, economic development, turbulent past, all the rest of it, right? So as we know it, broadly speaking, I mean, in art market speak, I mean, Asia is divided into 5 major regions. So there you go. So China, as we know it, probably the most unique case study ever. If you think about, just again thinking about Claire's stats, I mean, over 10 years, it's a colossal jump. Everything grows exponentially. It has led to such dramatic growths, and I'm sure Chinese collectors are no strangers to all of you, because they've headlined the news for so long, whether it's secondary market or primary market. And there's been a lot of talk about the young, fearless Chinese collectors, the proliferation of private museums, whatever that means, within this Chinese context. And then next, Southeast Asia, probably the youngest region you could ever, within the sort of within the Asian context and Asian history, because again, this is a melting pot. As you can see, Southeast Asia is made up of about 10 nations. Mostly, I think most countries gained independence after the Second World War. We have a huge post-colonial history. The reason why I say we is because I come from Malaysia, and I know all too well about the post-colonial hang-ups. And also the question of identity, history, politics. I mean, I'm sure you know about, everyone who's read the news would know about Pol Pot, for example. So a lot of this has also marred developments as you know it. I thought maybe Thailand is actually worth mentioning here because in similar cases to like what happened with India, for the longest time, I remember like when I first came back to Southeast Asia, and this was like circa late 90s, there was so much talk about Thailand, great artists, dynamic art scene. And at that time, the government did so much to push Thailand out to the forefront. I think Venice Biennial 2003, Thailand's presence in Venice over the next few years. But then everything just went quiet after post-Thaksin, the post-red and yellow fight for power, and everything's been, and it's a shame because it doesn't mean that there's no art scene in Thailand. There is. It's just that it hasn't gone out for the longest time. And at the same time, I mean, there's just such great artists who should be seen but have not been brought out for some time. And then you have Singapore, by default, the regional hub. And in some ways, Singapore also acts as a hub for Asia, for Australia and New Zealand as well. I mean, it connects them to Southeast Asia in that sense, geographically. And of course, Indonesia and Philippines that we can't exclude. It was interesting just looking at that chart with the number of billionaires compared to millionaires, and you saw 2% in Indonesia and no millionaires in Indonesia at all, which is fascinating. But again, these are the two of the most prominent emerging markets that we have. Very dynamic art scenes. Before my job as Art Basel director, I was a curator and I specialized in Southeast Asian art. And again, very interesting imbalance there because, in Indonesia, you have great collectors or collectors who are really passionate about the arts, and I mean it in every sense of the word. And at the same time, you've got wonderful non-profits in particular cities, a great, and very, very active art scene to a certain extent. But at the moment, there aren't any galleries. There are about like 2 or 3 major galleries that are active, and that's about it. And if you compare it to 10 years ago, everyone wanted to open a gallery because it was great business. So again, it's all these sort of imbalance that I think that makes talking about Asia as a whole to be quite problematic. The Indian subcontinent. Similar to the Thailand story, India, I think early to late 90s through all the way to pre-2008 crash was at the forefront. I think we looked at the BRIC countries, the BRIC years, and India was definitely there. Again, wonderful collectors. They were making headlines. And then again, post-2008, they took such a big hit compared to China, and then as you see it now, it's slowly picking up pace. Indian collectors are not that visible anymore in the auctions, for example. But having said that, the local market continues to run. I think now I've heard that there's so much more activity happening in India. For example, in Mumbai, they've got this whole gallery weekend going, and I think now in Delhi we've got the Indian Art Fair, and again. A sort of active local scene that's sort of chugging along, but does not necessarily translate beyond their shores. And then I think the other thing to also keep in mind is, again, the post-colonial hang-up. India, a strong British colony for the longest time, and within the Indian consciousness, it's a tendency to look west rather than to look east. For any Indian, the idea of summering in London or in New York is common, whereas the thought of them going to Hong Kong is like, why? But this is really, it has a lot to do with our heritage, it's a lot to do with our histories, it's a lot to do with your own affinity to different cultures because of how the story of the nation was shaped. And I think what I'm trying to say, sorry, I shouldn't have clicked this map, but I think what I'm trying to say is like, and sorry, I forgot one of the most important markets ever, the Northeast, which is Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. As we know it, it's the most developed, the most mature market in Asia. Seasoned collectors, it's got a strong gallery network that is perhaps most akin to Western models. It's got great museums. I mean, Lyon is probably one of my favorite in Asia, and it stands as a beacon to all of us in terms of, you know, achievements and aspirations and inspiration. And I think, you know, I think it's having said all that and having mapped this all out in geographical terms, I think what I'm trying to say to you is that, you know, we are such a great mix of one, ex-colonies, as opposed, which means that also some of our societies are more heterogeneous than others. There's more of a racial mix compared to, say, Japan or Korea, where, you know, it tends to be more homogenous. And also, the other thing about Asia that we should always bear in mind is that information flow doesn't circulate the same way one might expect in Europe or in America. I mean, I remember the days when I came back, and I remember I was so interested in learning about Indonesia, but there was no information except the fact that you have to physically go there and find out and speak to people. Of course, that has changed. I mean, internet has changed that tremendously. But nevertheless, I think the way information flows here, it doesn't really flow within Asia as one might expect it. It may flow across different continents because of different affinities, again. So again, the whole notion of Asia as a whole is really difficult to grapple with, because we are together, but we're not. You know, I mean, think about, for example, Korea and India. What is the connection there? And for an Indian to go to Korea is perhaps more common now because of K-pop, but in the past it'd be like, I don't see the connection. You know, whereas, yeah, so it's a very interesting sort of way of looking at how we've grown. And I think, like it or not, I mean, despite internet, despite social media, despite the fact that the world is happening so much faster now, we are still fragmented in so many different ways. You know, I mean, I think there have been more of centers, and this is where I was going to show you this, because I think art fairs over the past 10, 15 years has played a role in trying to bring people together. Because in the past, the art world would only meet at biennials or triennials or major exhibitions mounted for Asian art. And there hasn't been that many to begin with. And I think, you know, art fairs have done that since, you know, say, I think 10, 15 years ago. I mean, I remembered the early days of CIGE in Beijing or SH Contemporary circa 2006. And that was like perhaps one of the first few times that we actually saw so many different galleries from different parts of Asia coming together. I mean, I think that was like probably the first time I met like galleries from India and all the rest of it, and actually had any kind of physical interaction with them if I didn't go to their country. And I think, you know, I think not to toot our own horns, but I mean, I think, of course, the Art Basel show has also played a tremendous role in sort of forming a sort of center, but we're only 5 days in a year, and I don't know if that's really substantial enough to really say that, you know, we are fully integrated. Of course, now you have Shanghai, which is coming up in November, the Shanghai Art Week with West Bund and 021, and I think, you know, I think that will make another, you know, I think that will be another great gathering of Asians in 1 year. But I mean, but my question is really, is this all enough? You know, and it goes back to what Claire's last slide of economic wealth and the other two cogs, which I can't remember right now, but I know what it was anyway.
Was it
but again,
regulation?
it was infrastructure, wasn't it? And I think there was
regulations.
Yes, regulations. And I think that is also the other thing that, I mean, I think that needs to be considered, because it is an ecosystem. Of course, the art market, we have collectors, we have art markets, we have galleries and all the rest of it, but I think the other thing that we really need to consider are the infrastructures. Where are they? Are they well placed? You know, some countries have great numbers of collectors, like Indonesia, Philippines, but the art infrastructure is really, it's just really not there. I mean, there is no government support, there's very little of it. A lot of it comes from private initiatives. So it's really a big question here, and I mean, no doubt we know that Asia is going to continue to grow, because economically speaking, yes, a number of these countries, you know, are still growing. They've just started to have a flourishing local economy, and population demographics are all, you know, it's all great news. But what does it mean as a full continent? I think it's really something that we need to watch and also just wait.
Thank you very, very much, Adeline. It's actually fantastic to have, I suppose, we spend so much time looking at it from the outside, and to hear about Asia, not just being Asia, from the inside is super. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. So we thought, because Clare and Adeline are so expert, we thought that in the discussion they don't just get one journalist, they're going to get three. So I would like to invite up on the stage to join me Filipa Ramos, who is the editor-in-chief of Art Agenda, and Amy Sherlock, who is the deputy editor of Frieze magazine and also the commissioning editor for Asia, are going to kick off. The quick goodness me, it's like the Spice Girls, but they're gonna kick off the questions.
Hello.
We are exactly. We are. Are we all? Can everyone hear and see? Would one of you like to start the conversation? Was there any questions that came up from what we've just heard? And then, of course, I will open it up to questions soon.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's very nice to see this talk so well attended, and thank you so much for your presentations. Maybe I would start with a question that is a direct response of what you were talking about, Clare. And just to continue your reflection between growth and art interest, because something that I was asking myself, and I don't think there's a final question a final answer to this question, but while you were presenting all the different graphics, something that I asked myself is, how can we assure that this relation that there is between economical growth and interest in contemporary art in particular can continue to exist, in the sense, how can we make sure that contemporary art remains a relevant asset, an asset in which it is important for people to invest? Because you spoke mostly about the economical growth, and of course it's something we cannot relate to, but it's something we need to be aware of, because currently, and we've never seen so many people attending art fairs, attending exhibitions, interested in contemporary art as we are seeing today. And what I think is that we hope that this interest remains alive for all of us, for us who work in art publications, for those who work in art fairs and galleries, but also in institutions. So, and you touched a little bit on that, but I wonder if it's something you've been reflecting about on this relation.
Can I just jump in and ask a question as a kind of preface to that? When you were speaking about we're talking about the art market in kind of holistic terms, which presumably breaks down into various subsectors within that. How much of that growth in the Asian art market that you've identified as being driven by contemporary art specifically, and how much is I don't know, is kind of classical works, antiquity, was that all part of your kind of analysis?
I'll answer that's kind of the easier, slightly
that's
easier
the kind of
question
that's
first.
the background to this question, I think. Yeah.
I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but if you look at the global art market, or the percentage of post-war and contemporary sales, for example, in the US or UK, they're the huge slice. They're over half. Whereas in Asia, it's the smallest slice in most countries. In China, it's one of the smallest markets. I mean, the divisions, when I get the data, are a little bit different. They don't kind of define it in the same way, but the big sectors are some of the decorative sectors and the older Chinese paintings and things like that. So it's actually the smallest in terms of value.
But it's also growing?
Yeah, it is growing, and this is what I was saying, like, just because these countries don't register on these global charts doesn't mean they don't have very dynamic local scenes. It's just that the price level and the value on aggregate is not enough to kind of get a big slice of that pie, because it's just so skewed towards the US and UK. And it kind of, I'm not sure if I'm going to answer this correctly, but you can guide me along. I think one of the big problems in keeping people interested in contemporary art is that and this is a kind of a really bad infrastructural problem I see as an outsider looking into the art market, is the really heavy focus on the top end, and the focus in the media. I have to take a little swipe, and elsewhere on, just because this is what makes news, on a very select and small group of artists. And Uli again was talking about this earlier as well, the people's collections looking the same, having the same artists in them, and people not taking risks. And they're not, there's about probably 30 artists that everybody wants around the world. And I think this is the danger for these really dynamic scenes in getting them on that pie, is that everybody focuses on the same artists, and there's not enough interest. And it's a big problem, because for the high-end galleries and for everyone like that to keep on going, they need the incubators at the bottom of the cycle to develop those artists to start with. And it's a big problem of their artists getting cherry-picked once they get to a certain level. And it's the same with some of the local markets here. Artists, once they get to a certain level, then get sold in London and New York and Hong Kong predominantly. So it's this kind of focus on the high end, and I don't really know, I don't know the answer to how we address that, but it's why the middle market has suffered so greatly. I mean, my figures of that fantastic growth mask so much of what's going on underneath. That fantastic growth has been driven so much by the high end. If you look at auction sales over the last 10 years, the market over $1 million has been growing at about 400%. The market at less than, underneath has been negative, and the market above 10 million has been growing by thousands of percents. So they do influence the figures so much. When I say the market's boomed over 10 years, it's very much the top end has boomed, and it's the same, I think, in the contemporary market. There's such a focus on a limited number of artists, but I don't know how you get people to take more risks and support more mid-sized galleries, whether it's, again, I think the fairs and things are very important, and how things are placed with each other, and how they're publicized a little bit in the media as well. Maybe, I know it's difficult to, that's the kind of headline generating thing is what's sold for some ridiculously high amount, but if there was some way to make the middle market more interesting to the general public and get a wider bunch of people involved in the art market, instead of, I mean, you even see it at some art fairs, you see the same collectors going around as well, so it's just to get a young people and new collectors feeling more comfortable in buying, I think would be a great start.
I'd love to hear Adeline's thoughts on this.
I think everything Claire said is true. It's the mid-market, that's one thing. But I think what goes undocumented are also like the collectors that in some ways are very similar to Uli in spirit, which, who collect deep, who collect only art from their own countries. I think, it's true, and it's not just about the media, but it's about how we are today. I think it's bigger, better, faster, more. But I think what goes undocumented or unmentioned are like some of these great collectors who are there chugging along in their own world, who don't necessarily need any international attention, but just quietly collecting and supporting their local art scenes. I mean, we have that. I mean, just speaking from my perspective in Southeast Asia, you see so many different collectors who will tell you, don't invite me to your fair because I'm only interested in art in my own country. Like, I'm just going to waste space in your show. But my answer to them is, no, you should come because you are also an inspiration in so many ways, because this is counter to what is trendy, which is I want the first 30 top names that everybody else has. So I think a lot of it is also about mindsets, I think. And I think this whole supporting the middle market is one thing, but I think a lot of it goes back to infrastructure, it goes back to education, it goes back to outreach in the biggest way. Because it's true that some people buy art because of what they see in the headlines. So immediately everyone assumes that it's asset is great investment. But I mean, on the flip side, there is also the greater good of culture, of supporting culture that we all know. And I think there isn't enough of that going on. I mean, sometimes it's to do with economic state of a government. So it's like, I need to sort out healthcare and education before we can do culture. Fair enough, but these are some of the, just for us, like in Hong Kong, like you see that there is such a captured audience in a sense, like, having to turn people away, for example, from the convention center during the week of our shows, shows you that there are people here who are interested in art, who may not have the means to buy, but you never know, right? I mean, it's about influencing that society, it's about influencing the community. It's about getting people to actually appreciate art and not think that this is only just for rich people and only available to rich people.
Do you think there's also an economic parallel here? Because I think very much in the West, we have a very polarized, we have the very rich and the others, whereas actually in Asia, but in a lot of the countries we're talking about, this middle class that Clare idea, actually that gives me a bit more hope for the future of art. That maybe there will be more incubating and more nurturing once the systems are in place.
I mean, just looking at Claire's charts give me hope, because I think that we know that Asia's growing, and I certainly hope that particular nations within their own Ministry of Cultures or whatever will do their part in terms of developing their audience. I mean, Korea is a great example of this. To a certain extent, Japan, but like say somewhere like India, where there's so rich with talent and also such a literate society, it's a shame that that they can't do more in terms of establishing more public institutions, in terms of more greater education, and just I think generally most people in Asia would never think of buying art, because that's like, why buy art when I can buy watches or I can buy property? Because, I mean, let's not forget the fact that a lot of Asian countries are made of migrants. Where I come from, my mother would tell me, don't forget your passport, make sure you have some gold on you, because if you ever need to run, this is your currency. And for most people, like, buying art would be like, why? I can't run with it, unless it's a miniature of some sort. But so the notion of buying art, this is still all very new. I mean, it's the past 15, 20 years, and it's something that people have come to appreciate. Unless, I mean, it's only been, if you come from sort of very wealthy families in the past, when your public role, you need to do your role, you need to honor your role as patrons, you need to support society. But that's so few and far between within the sort of Asian context and the Asian families who can afford to do that. And it's really just becoming apparent now, right, with the growing middle class, and also the sort of, like, it's become trendy to collect art. For some people, they collect without knowing why they're collecting. And it's, again, back to what Uli was saying. My friend bought it, so now I feel the peer pressure to buy the same. And so, yeah, I mean, it's all sort of very new and young.
I guess it's interesting that you're talking about kind of art state-sponsored infrastructure, because that's what China actually doesn't have. I mean, the Power Station of Art, which opened, 10 years ago now, is the first, 9 years ago, the only contemporary art publicly funded institution. So you have what fills that gap is the very high-end collectors, who therefore not only are influencing the market, but also the arts education at that level, which is kind of interesting. And I wonder what the outlook of that is further down the line.
I'm hopeful about China. I think I think there will be more. I mean, if you think about, for example, the biennial, like for example Shanghai as a city, or even like Guangzhou, southern China. I think there's so much happening in southern China that shouldn't be overlooked as well. And different state, different province, prefecture have their own way of governing. For example, Shanghai realizes the cultural currency and has really done a lot. I mean, and as a result, we have the Shanghai Art Week. And I think you'll see more of that happening in China, and I hope that you'll see more of that happening all across Asia. I mean, Singapore does a great job with that, but then the flip side of Singapore, for example, is the imbalance, in the sense that, you've got great national support, but then the market isn't substantial enough. So it lacks a certain way. So it's always about finding the right balance, isn't it?
Grabbing what Clare was saying about the current challenges, let's say, to medium galleries, a phenomena that, I'll go a little bit in the detour to get to the question, but a phenomena that we've been assisting in the past is somehow the growth and the multiplication of galleries that became quite big in terms of, and especially Western galleries that start opening franchised, that they franchise themselves here and there and everywhere, and also in Asia, and this, thinking about this led me also to question the basic title of this panel, and thinking, can we think about a market, a future market, where there is a bigger integration, a bigger dialogue and exchange between Asian and the global market, because clearly there is a very strong attempt from commercial galleries to become global and to lose their local presence and to grow, not only to grow, but to expand themselves to other regions. So I wonder what your thoughts are about this possibility or this future of a market being conceived in a global way.
More two-way.
Just
till now, it's been Western galleries opening in Asia, and you wonder. I mean, is that?
My question is if in the near future can we think about a market that is more global? Hmm?
Yeah, I think so. I think these are wider issues, and Alan mentioned education and travel and all these things. So there's, when you're looking just at the market and people opening businesses, that's a very simplified view of what causes these. It's a lot bigger picture than we're saying. And just to pick up a little bit on what you said, I think there's such a focus at the moment on producing children as these little economic units that are good at finance and good at sport. And arts education, particularly contemporary art, is probably not on the curriculum for most schools, which is a bigger issue. I know these things are really long term, and nobody really wants to kind of get into it because they just take too long. But those things are the real underlying things. But I think in terms of the openness of countries to the fact that to make it a two-way flow, as Melanie was saying, the reason why Hong Kong has become such a hub in Asia is that it has that kind of two-way flow so well. I mean, if you look at the index for economic freedom for 2017, Hong Kong is number 1, Singapore is number 2. Even the US is down near 20, I think about 17 or 18, and then China is much further down in the hundreds. So the fact that there's such an easy two-way flow, and that they're open to it while it being a safe place to do business and stuff as well is what makes it such an important regional hub. And I think we've seen it in other countries as well. I'm just thinking of, we were discussing Brazil. It's been really good at pushing its art out into the world, but it's very, very difficult to get international art back into Brazil. So it's done a lot on the exporting side, being really good at making sure that it gets out into the world. But it has such a complicated and high and terrible selection of import VAT and taxes that it's impossible to bring more art in. And they do give temporary allowances for fairs and things, but it's those kind of lessons to learn from, I suppose, is to make sure it's not just getting the art out into the world, it's having it come back in, and as Melanie very rightly put it, a two-way.
I think also what I found very interesting from the panel before, and actually picking up on something Adeline said, was that actually in this world we're in now, which seems to be unfailingly global, I mean, I think I woke up in London this morning, I'm not sure, but I think there does seem to be a craving for more and more local. It's sort of much more than I think 5-10 years ago, when every fair that opened was an international fair. We suddenly realized actually there's enough. We have Basel, possibly Frieze, and we have a couple of older art fairs that are international. We don't need every other fair to be international. It's actually quite nice to have some local as well. But I don't know if that's part of the question you're answering or just an aside.
I just wanted to return to, Claire, your point about the favourable regulatory systems. Do you think actually that the fact that it's so difficult to do business in China will stop Shanghai and Beijing becoming the global art centres that Hong Kong currently is until 2047 anyway.
I think it is that it's the, I think they'll find ways around it, and their government is very eager to do that. So they will create more favourable. And they've seen even just last year that it reduced the import VAT and things like that. But there is still a lot of things that besides just fixing the regulation, there's things that we've discussed that take time to develop all the expertise. And when I've talked to galleries in Beijing and Shanghai, and they can't get access to some of the ancillary services, they're all taken up by the auction sector. So the specialized shipping and conservation and all those things that you just take for granted in New York or London, those businesses are not developed as well. So I think it's regulation is one thing, but it is that kind of very solid infrastructure of all the, and this is why the art market is so important as well, because it's not just sales for a few rich people. It supports so many businesses, and it has such a positive ripple effect in the economies that it's important in.
Do you want to add something, or?
I agree with, of course, and I think apart from that, I think always have something to add about just southern China. I think it's something that you guys should really always concentrate on. Yes, Beijing and Shanghai are definitely on the global front, but I think southern China also has its own hold, and I think as a location or I think as a hub, I think there is also a lot of potential that will come up with southern China. Also because I think partly the way, like for example, Shenzhen has been fashioned as a design center, design incubator, and let's not forget the number of institutions there are in Shenzhen.
The V&A opens December, start of December.
The V&A is opening and coming up. There are several other privately owned museums that also have a public program, which also something, again, that's some sort of recognition. And in so many ways, if you think about infrastructure, and if you think about the museums that work in Asia, broadly speaking, often they stem from private initiatives, whether it's Korea, whether it's somewhere like Philippines or even Indonesia. And these are basically private for public, which I think is also a very interesting study again.
And I think a lot of our museums, the Frick is always the one that comes up, but a lot of museums, even in our old system, were private museums. I'm not saying every single private museum in China will be a roaring success, but one or two might be.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think without something like, for example, Long or Yus, how else will you see art apart from galleries?
Yeah. Are there any particular, I was just thinking about India and how maybe one of the things that happened to India was that everyone got terribly excited about art as an investment, and they went in on contemporary art and it all shot up and people made lots of money for a year, and then it crashed very, very seriously. And I think that maybe put people off in India. How does the rest of Asia, you were talking about the attitude, not sure whether and why to buy art. Do you see, is there too much of an opinion that it needs to be an investment, or is that changing?
I think definitely changing. I think, changing on two fronts. I think in the past, I know collectors who only used to buy from auction houses, for example. And then you see that trend, the sort of mindset shifting, and then eventually realizing, oh, I can actually buy this from a gallery. You see that changing. I think you see also collectors actually buying art for the love of it more. I think you see more of that now. It was funny because I heard Richard saying, nobody wants to buy art that is not going to be valued at whatever. I think basically no one wants to make a loss on art. Sure, I think that's definitely true. I think you can't take that away from any collector's mindset. But I think more and more I see, especially a particular generation, and I say that would be between the 30 to the 50-year-olds now. Of course, upper middle class or gaining more wealth. They are the ones who are basically driving that market. Also in the sense of buying because it's something they love, and they'll say, heck, you know, I'll buy video, even though everybody says there's no value in video, but I like it. So I think, yeah, so seeing people like that gives me hope. Encountering them gives me hope. So definitely.
The auction, and to that point about, I just wondered whether, Claire, your statistics could be broken down according to kind of whether you had a sense of the division between primary and secondary market within that, where actually kind of what's driving the growth, and whether that's regionally different, or whether the growth is the auction sales, or it's actually smaller galleries.
The growth in China has been very much driven by auction sales, unfortunately. And although some primary artists do interact directly with the auction sector, it's mainly secondary market sales. And I mean, I think this is again, it's something that's, just because it's low at the moment, that's a more hopeful thing, I think, that will develop. And I think, you know, what happened maybe in 2012, particularly in the auction market in China, the fact that it took a big drop, and that really shook out a lot of the more speculative funds, and they had crazy 3-year funds with really high rates, and people realized that, okay, that doesn't actually work always in the art market. And also, I mean, though, you know, nobody particularly liked it, the government scrutiny of the market, trying to sort through what was going on and any kind of dubious practices, it has dampened the growth, but what every market wants is slow and steady and upwards, rather than this hugely rapid speculative kind of things that are just bound to, when there's too many speculators, there's usually some kind of rush for liquidity. We saw that in the Japanese case, related to something else, and everybody tries to get out at the same time, and all those things happen and the market completely bombs. So what China and every market wants is a slow and steady development, and I think the fact that it's had more scrutiny from the government, it still needs a lot of regulations. There seems to be regulations in place in some cases, but they're not enforced. The non-payment at auction, you know, there's regulation, all these kind of things. There's a lot of issues there that need to be still further. But the fact, you know, it's slow and steady upwards, you know, would be hopefully the way forward.
I have a question which is more directly to Adeline. And it's concerning models and formats, and new models and formats also of galleries, and thinking your relationship with Art Basel, and the importance that fairs are playing more and more in the largest part, in becoming those that assure that the large part of the economical transactions are being done, while most galleries will tell you that they sell very little in their galleries, while all the sales are done in fairs. Taking this in consideration, how do you, and knowing your role and your responsibility as a huge art fair, what do you think that the future model or the future possibility of a commercial gallery will be? Will it be beyond its physical existence in the space? How will it relate to the space of the fair?
This is interesting because I think, I don't know, from the Asian context, I think it's actually the flip side, that from a number of galleries coming to, for example, the Hong Kong show, like, for example, let me think. Galleries from India, for example, India, Indonesia, Philippines, and all the rest of it actually realize that they have local buyers for these art. In fact, they don't even really need to come out, because coming out to them is a loss, because, you know, I have to pay for additional booth lights, blah, 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 the whole shipping. It's like, why burn a hole in my pocket? But for them, the Asian galleries see coming to Hong Kong they regard it as a very different platform, which is, it's about exposure. So like someone like Pearl Lam always says, you know, art fairs are like magazine advertisements. It's about coming out there, it's about making a loss because people might not buy, but you know, it's about getting my artist names out there. So the Asian gallery model is slightly different, I think, in their approach towards art fair. I understand that there are certain galleries, like from particular countries, like say Brazil, for example, or Greece, for example, who do a lot of their business overseas because economies are just not there. But I think this is the flip side of the story in Asia, because I think the opposite is true, where actually I'm trying to convince galleries, please don't pre-sell your works before you come. because then what's the point, in fact, try and make new friends, meet people, and try and spread the art out there. And it's great for your artists to be placed beyond your own local shores. And I think this mindset has become it used to be quite challenging to try and get people to actually, play that game. But I think more and more now, I think, galleries are aware that this is the one time when I can actually meet clients from not only just most parts of Asia, but I also meet them from Europe, from America, from Africa. So it's really understanding that there can be an audience for my artists beyond my local shores. Because I think the other thing that we should never discount is that sort of mentality that Asian art doesn't get a lot of credibility beyond their local shores because it's never shown in great international institutions, for example. I think Uli just took a stab at Clare just now, purely because of that. Because I think, and in some ways, like it or not, Asia will still need the validation of the West. Like it or not, when a show happens in a Guggenheim, it changes everything. But this is what it is. This is the benchmark for all of us within the art world. And I think so it's a lot of that. I mean, it's that feeling of always being the underdog, but you're not, and the model has to change, right? And your mindset has to change. And I think galleries in the past, a number of galleries from Asia, I mean, it's not that we don't understand the Western model, but it was just that a lot of people made it up as they go along from whatever they learned. It's like, oh, there's exclusivity. Oh, fine, then it's like everybody's like, oh, I want to have exclusivity. I want to only work with, my artist should only work with me and not work with you. I mean, but then as time goes by, you realize that, okay, that's not how it works. And then other things like commissions, the whole entire gallery system of contracts, consignments, and all the rest of it. This is relatively a new thing for all of us in this part of the world. Whereas I think for Europe and America, it's you already have that book. And here we're like, where is the book? We're still trying to figure out what the information is. Because, I mean, sitting here as the director of Art Basel, I mean, it's conflicting because I see galleries asking me, going, why do we always have to play by Western rules? Why? Why can't we do what we do the way we like it?
I think there are oddities in the Western system that actually I hope this kind of exchange will iron out, to be honest.
Exactly.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up in case are there any questions, because I don't want to run out of time before you guys have had a chance to ask any questions. Were there any questions on the future? Oh, yes. Do we have any more microphones? Is the other question.
Yep. I think the art market of a Western art market and Asian art market is a little bit different because in Western art market, the buy side and the sell side is going together. But in Asian art market, the buy side and sell side moves not together. For example, in case of Korea, the Korean art market has shrinked since 2009, and it has shrinking constantly and shrink to at least 30% since the peak time. But the buy side, the market is growth double. So I think the reason is, although the buy side art market of Asia, the collectors are buying the Western contemporary art rather than Asian contemporary art. So actually the Asian market, the supply side failed to attract even the Asian collectors as well as Western collectors. So that's the reason why, although the people expect that the Asian market will grow, very positive data, but actually the sell side market has not grown that much. For example, although the Art Basel Hong Kong started 2012 and it had been 5 years, but other big growth big mega art fairs like Piano, Frieze, Emery Show does not is reluctant to come in. That's because the sell side market is not seem to grow that much.
So can I just to check? So when you say sell side, what you're saying is you think there's a mismatch because people from here are buying Western art, but there aren't enough Westerners buying Korean art.
Yes, exactly.
I didn't know.
I think that's a very strong point, that the two sides are dislocated, and this is what I was referring to earlier, is that there's very good and dynamic, especially contemporary markets in many of the smaller markets in Asia, but they still don't generate a high value of sales, and a lot of the collectors from I know Australia's not in there, but a lot of the in Japan and countries buy elsewhere, and they don't just buy Western art elsewhere. They buy Asian art outside of Asia and outside of, certainly most of it's now so centered on Hong Kong with Art Basel, with Christie's and Sotheby's, and the big auction houses centered there. So I think you've hit the nail on the head exactly. The buying side has been growing so rapidly, and the selling side, bar China, has been growing at a much slower pace. So that is a very interesting thing. And just one other thing, I mean, just to pick up on what you said, I've been going to kind of panels and things in China for about 10 years, and I think there is a real interest to see, you know, what the Western models have to offer, but there's no reason at all that they should make all the same mistakes and do all the bad things as well. And I think, you know, there's a kind of a learning curve, but I think the Asian market will do its own thing, and I think that's a great thing.
Adeline, do you have? I mean, I noticed at your fair in March more, in fact, quite a lot of Korean art, although not maybe not contemporary, and there's lots of contemporary and modern. I get a sense that maybe that's shifting, but slowly. Is it?
No, I think, you know, I can't definitely disagree with you. It's true. I mean, you know, often Asian collectors tend to want to buy Western art, and it's not as congruous as we like it to be. I agree. I think it's shifting. It's shifting slowly. I think tastes, again, also one thing is about taste. Two, it's also about just exposure to art from your own part of the world. I think for many of us, sometimes, as I said, information flow. It has never really flown the way it should, and therefore, in some ways, you're still learning about art from your own region. And I feel like I'm still definitely learning. I mean, there's so much about Korean art that I will never know because I can't access the language unless I speak Korean. And I think that sort of change is palpable, but it's happening. But but I think we still need time for that to settle itself.
And just to add something to the considerations that you had, Adeline, when you're doing your presentation. And as much as there isn't a single Asia, there's also not a single West, no? And that issue is exactly what we have. Coming from a Southern European country, we have the same problem. Why aren't we as successful exporting our artists and having strong galleries as another Western country, for instance? So it's all these dynamics. When you go to the more specific, they also exist, and they're exactly represented in the same way on a small scale.
Yeah, I agree. It's always the devil of the details, right? I mean, when you look at raw pictures, it's always easy.
So I'm very grateful for your map. That's a very good point. Are there any other questions about the market in general? I'm going to ask one more. Well, one to each of you, I suppose. If you had to pick one area of the market, Clare, as in one country within, that you think is where buyers are really going to surge in the next 5 years, and then Adam, I don't know if any artists. Is there a country where you've seen recently art and you think maybe in the next 5 years we should all have a look at them? Go, why don't you?
My answer is probably very boring because just from the wealth dynamics and the growth in urban populations and that upper middle class is probably China still. But even though looking at those GDP per capita, you know, Philippines, Indonesia, those countries that are really growing so fast, I think there's a lot of ones to watch besides the obvious ones. I see the very big picture obvious ones, so there probably is a lot more going on than I
Barring any sort of natural disaster or any political coup. Really. I think, I'm from Southeast Asia. I think in so many ways I will always wave the Southeast Asian flag because I think, you know, as in terms of talent, I think in terms of great stories to tell, I think there's so many artists from my part of the world that should be, you know, I think we should all keep a lookout for. But then at the same time, I'm also very hopeful for India. You know, I mean, I'm always very touched by India every time I go because you know how difficult it is right now. I mean, for certain artists to make a living, and yet they remain artists. And I think that's a testament to conviction and also to their passion and the fact that this is really what we want to do. And I really certainly hope that, you know, that will come. I mean, that will happen because economically speaking, this is the next largest country that's going to grow after China. So fingers crossed.
I think Japan as well on the buying side. A lot of dealers have been telling me they're seeing in the last maybe 2 years the return of a lot of Japanese buyers. I've seen very obvious examples at the high end, but the return of Japan in terms of buying. So there's another one to important one to watch.
I've seen evidence, and again, not just Mr. Zozo Town, but I've seen evidence of it as well as in Japan is interesting. Super. Well, on that note, I'm just going to say, Claire, Adeline, Amy, Filipa, thank you so much for being such an engaging and lively panel, and thank you all very much for listening and for ending your day here. Have a very good evening. Bye-bye.